It's been more than 100 days since the start of the war in Gaza. Allegations of genocide by Israel will be judged by an international court. But can anything alleviate the suffering and destruction of the people in that enclave? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. South Africa has brought a case against Israel, which it accuses of genocide. A decision will take years, which is time the people of Gaza simply do not have.
There's no question Gazas are being killed. The world can see it's happening.
The first genocide in history, where its victims are broadcasting their own destruction in real time, in the desperate, so far vain hope that the world might do something.
But proving genocide is difficult because it's about demonstrating intent to eradicate or displace a targeted people. Israel maintains it's defending itself.
Astonishingly, the court has been requested to indicate a provisional measure calling on Israel to suspend its military operations. But this amounts to an attempt to deny Israel its ability to meet its obligations to the defense of its citizens.
The ICJ's experience adjudicating on genocide can be counted on one hand. In 2007, it ruled Serbia failed to prevent genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but did not find the country guilty. In 2021, provisional measures imposed on Myanmar required the military junta to stop its forces from committing genocide and to preserve all relevant evidence. It has not complied. And the ICJ similarly made a provisional order for Russia to stop its war in Ukraine. That war continues. The court's decisions are legally binding, but there's no real mechanism for enforcement. While both sides gather evidence, the judges deliberate, and an answer over the term genocide is formed, women and children are dying. This case has shown that there are those willing to speak on Gaza's behalf, but will there ever be any action?
Let's meet our guests. In Boulder, Colorado, in the United States, is Wadie Said. He is a professor of law at the University of Colorado. Joining us from Nairobi in Kenya, Peter Herbert, a human rights barrister and former Defence League counsel at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. In Cape Town is Cathy Powell, associate professor in public law at the University of Cape Town. And here with me in the studio is James Henderson, a legal researcher at Law for Palestine. That's a not-for-profit human rights organisation. Great to see you all on Roundtable. Wadie, I'll come to you first. I mean, any ruling in all of this could take years, I read, and time is something that the people of Gaza simply do not have.
Yes, that's true, and that's why I think the measure or the action brought by South Africa called for provisional measures, which are what everyone is waiting to see what they are, what the court produces. Obviously, the fear of some sort of, political machinations coming into this process is also part of what's being discussed, as the legitimacy of the International Court of Justice is also kind of at play here, as this particular horrible situation of an attack on Gaza has produced an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy for what in this country they deem the international order, which is, a kind of code for American preeminence, if you like, around the world and in the international system.
Peter, I read that there is going to be a turnaround of the judges at the ICJ in February. Are we likely to see an interim ruling before then, just at that point when they switch over?
I would hope so. In fact, I mean, the 15-person judge panel may well come back within weeks. It's certainly expected to come back within weeks. And for Palestinians in Gaza, in fact, for progressive people around the world, it can't come a moment too soon. They are chosen from 15 different nationalities, and hopefully they are able to avoid or at least obviate the obvious political pressure that is clearly being exercised by national governments.
Cathy, talk us through how all of this has gone down with the South African public, and are you proud that your country has taken this stance?
I am, personally, and I've picked up a lot of pride from my fellow citizens. It's actually been quite interesting. I've done interviews over the years on South Africa's action in the foreign sphere. And this is the first time that South African media has asked me questions about the case in terms of first person, singular, plural. So interviewers ask me, are we going to win? How strong is our case at the ICJ? And previously, media interviews have spoken about South Africa in the third person as though we're somehow removed. So I think this case has made South Africans feel that they're doing something worthwhile. Obviously, there is a lot of polarization within the country as well. It's not as if everybody accepts this application, but those who are in support of it are very glad that the government has actually done something and that it put together such a good legal team to do so.
James, I want to come to the evidence. A lot of everything we've seen has been documented, filmed, shared, reported on. Social media, citizen journalists. How strong a case does South Africa have?
Well, South Africa put forward a very compelling case and relied a lot on verified UN sources, so rather independent source bases. When you look at Israel's arguments, the transcript of the case actually includes a lot of evidence from Israeli newspapers and Western journal sources. There's a clear evidence bias there. I think the compelling evidence that South Africa has relied upon is the UN evidence, and I think it built a really strong and compelling, airtight argument that really, really should hold up if the court is going to perform its job.
And Peter alluded to an interim decision when these judges turn over around the end of this month.
Yes.
What do you think that decision might be, or what would you like to see it be?
Ideally, I think everyone wants all of South Africa's provisional measures to be granted, but I do believe realistically we are going to see certain measures be discounted. Ultimately, that's where Israel's argument was fairly strong. It was on procedural elements. It wasn't so much on substantive law, but they did put forward legally compelling procedural cases. However, we are dealing with a case of genocide, and we rather hope that we're going to get a ruling based on the evidence and on the situation, as opposed to procedural measures in the ICJ.
Wadie, I want to put to you what the President of Israel, Herzog, said. He's described this case by South Africa as a blood libel. And obviously, Israel is going to defend itself robustly. What do you make of that phrase he's used, blood libel?
Well, I mean, we know that phrase as a historically anti-Semitic phrase used, to kind of slander European Jewry. So it's used, to my view, to my mind, is kind of curious, to say the least. I think what we've seen is a kind of an attempt at delegitimization by the Israeli kind of the Israeli government to a large degree. And they have their allies in this. I mean, in the United States, you have to remember that the spokesperson for the National Security Council, the Secretary of State, they've all referred to this as meritless, as if South Africa's incredible presentation and the 84-page document it submitted were kind of, just made up or full of, kind of fabricated allegations, and not a serious attempt to address what is the most pressing humanitarian situation that we have in the world today and have had in a very, very, very long time. So, I mean, it's to be expected, and it's also part and parcel of this Israeli campaign to kind of delegitimize the international bodies. You remember you had the Israeli ambassador to the UN calling for the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres's resignation, because he said that history didn't begin on October 7th. So I think this is part of a plan, or part of a kind of a scheme and a strategy.
Peter, I want to read to you how the United Nations define genocide. So the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life, calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So 5 points there, Peter. Do you think Israel is guilty?
I believe Israel is guilty of genocide, but the South African application is only for provisional measures. All they have to prove is that genocide is plausibly taking place, and that in order to have the provisional measures acceded to, they have to establish that there will be irreparable harm done to the people within the Gaza Strip. Now, when you have the facts given very eloquently by the South African lawyers, that 2,000-pound bombs have been dropped with amazing regularity by the Israeli Defense Force on civilian infrastructure, then that guarantees the reduction of life, of a destruction of whole or in part, solely of people in Gaza. It's the physical element of the actus reus, which is the physical acts, is made out, the factual basis. They have killed well over 25,000 inhabitants in only a 3-month period. And there is no doubt that this is quite deliberate. They say that these are surgical strikes. They're anything but surgical. A 2000 bomb is not a surgical instrument. It's an instrument of mass destruction, to coin a phrase, and one which Israel must be held accountable for. And so on all 5 elements, including the imposition of conditions where water, electricity, basic services, and in fact, they have made war on hospitals and UN schools. So one of the very egregious acts is that civilian populations have been leafleted and told to go to safe areas. They then drop 2,000-pound bombs on those safe areas. So there is nowhere in Gaza that is safe. And even in the West Bank, there have been alongside in parallel atrocities where innocent civilians as young as 2 or 3 years old have been shot indiscriminately by Israeli soldiers. It is absolutely a case of genocide. And in my mind, there is no doubt, in my experience, both as a former judge and as a lead counsel in Rwanda, that this satisfies all the 5 elements of genocide to be plausibly proved and have been plausibly proved by the South African application.
Cathy, do you get a feeling in South Africa that people are confident of success with this case?
Yes, I think that people following the proceedings, and almost everybody I know did, were very impressed by the level of detail in the written application, but also by the comprehensive and thoughtful manner in which each of the counsel presented their case, particularly their reference not only to UN certified facts, but to all the possible case law that could act as precedent. So I think that by the time the South African team had presented its case, a lot of international lawyers in South Africa also said they couldn't see how Israel was going to answer this. And Israel's response threw up a couple of surprises, I think particularly in the objection to the provisional measures requested and in the role that they brought self-defense into within the question of genocide. But a lot of that had been preempted and prepared for by the South African team. So I think the general mood here is that it is likely that the ICJ is going to at least order provisional measures, although not necessarily all the provisional measures that were applied for by South Africa.
James, are you surprised that more countries haven't sided with South Africa on this? Because if you're a world leader right now, in time, historians will sit down and will be writing about this. And surely you would want to be on the correct side of history.
I mean, you'd think so, Enda. But ultimately, we're seeing continued support by the USA, by the United States and the United Kingdom. Germany in particular has been very active in supporting Israel. It's said it will intervene in the case, which it has previously intervened in ICJ decisions. Gambia-Myanmar, we saw Germany intervene and push for a wider scope with regards to intention.
Why are they doing this? Why are the Germans doing this?
Honestly, it can only come down to the continued support for Israel from the sense of guilt Germany has over the Holocaust.
So it's historic guilt?
historic guilt, and that is the basis of Germany's continued support. We continue to see UK and US support, most likely through lobbying. There is a lot of lobbying in the US and the United Kingdom by Israel. Ultimately, the legal argument if a genocide is strong, and I feel history is going to judge the leaders of Western countries in particular quite harshly.
Wadie, can I ask you how you feel about these Western powers all being Israel's lapdog almost, just rowing in behind them regardless, and not in any way supporting South Africa? I mean, the United Kingdom in particular. How disappointed are you in some of these countries?
I mean, it's interesting because I think on an intellectual level, I don't know that I'm disappointed. I think that this was sort of predictable. But when we see it in action, it's actually quite shocking, as you mentioned. I think in the United States, to my view, for example, the response of President Biden after October 7th was telling in terms of how quickly and how adamantly he rushed to Israel's side in a way that spoke to things like fear of the United States losing its influence. This is America's key ally in the Middle East, and the U.S. was going to stand by it no matter what. And it has, shockingly, throughout all this incredible destruction that Israel has wrought, 20,000-pound bombs on hospitals, targeting over 100 journalists, etc. And with respect to Germany, it's almost laughable in that, the country's history, relatively recent by historical terms, in terms of actually carrying out a genocide, not just in Europe during the Second World War, but also you saw that Namibia rushed quickly into the fray to say Germany has no business defending Israel from charges of genocide, given its own history. And I bring up Namibia in particular because what we're also seeing is patterns of global solidarity with the Palestinians that have been there historically. The PLO was a historic ally of the Southwest African People's Organization, the group that basically liberated Namibia from kind of South African apartheid related control. And this is again part and parcel of this challenge to the Western-led international order, which I would say the vast majority of the world is articulating its refusal of the terms and the double standards that this order promotes.
Peter, what's your take on why other countries haven't rowed in behind the South Africans to support their case?
I think there's a significant degree of lobbying by the United States and Britain and the Northern Hemisphere behind the scenes. And that is largely why. But I think the German example is ridiculous, that they should stand and support Israel, partly because they only several weeks ago came to Tanzania and apologized for the genocide they committed in Tanzania, not just in Namibia. So the duplicity and hypocrisy of many nation states, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, is palpable. The hegemony of the United States is that if Joe Biden decided tomorrow to call for an unconditional ceasefire, then you would find a lot of these countries rowing in behind the United States. But it's the failure of the Western leadership to hold Israel to account that is largely responsible for the predicament in the first place. And you will know here that it was actually the establishment of the state of Israel by terrorist groups such as Irgun that killed almost 800 British soldiers before 1948 and Palestinians. So the origins of the state of Israel arise from the guilt of the Western powers in the aftermath of the Second World War, President Truman's creation of the state of Israel, where it was a woeful compromise between the legitimate rights of Jewish and Palestinian people to be able to live peaceably together. And therefore, this 70, 80 years later has come to haunt the world and the conscience of the world. So finally, all the world, if there is a race to the bottom and genocide is allowed to continue in Palestine, then genocide will be allowed to continue and crimes against humanity in the Ukraine and elsewhere. And nobody can then stand and wring their hands and say, well, this is some high moral standard we're upholding, because they will not. And that is one of the key reasons why I applaud the South African government and lawyers and people for taking this commendable action.
So, Peter, just briefly, do you think the Americans still have the same influence then?
Sadly, they do. Sadly, they do. The dollar is still king in the world, and the economic and political clout that you have is still one that many governments around the world are in fear of. And the fact that Britain, Germany, and the United Kingdom can bomb Yemen and the forces there unilaterally without a word said really by the international community speaks to that power. But truth has to be spoken to power. South Africa has done so, and it has caused, I think, many Israelis to question what their government is doing in their name. And certainly when I demonstrated the other Sunday in London, there were many members of the Jewish community who I applaud for saying that this is not done in their name, and anti-Semitism is not to be equated with Zionism or the State of Israel. They are mutually exclusive.
Cathy, I guess South Africa has been finding out who its friends really are then.
I think South Africa, when it looks for allies in this particular law case, must be aware of the political pressures that states are facing not to join it. And I think, that's been the focus of the discussion so far, is the political and economic power of the US and the West in preventing a stronger show of support for Palestine and a stronger criticism of Israel's actions. But let me just add a hopeful note at this point. We're talking about the power of law. And what is quite exciting about this case is that no matter how much economic and political pressure gets brought to bear, that the factors that will decide whether Israel has committed genocide are the factors that you read out earlier in this discussion. And lawyers go by that checklist. Similarly, the provisional measures are a set of objective questions that have to be answered. So even if South Africa were to stand alone before the court, first of all, I think there are signs of support from the global community, as Peter made clear. But also, it doesn't need anything more than a good argument and some facts and figures and legal precedent, all of which it's been able to present. I think the strongest legal argument that Israel has been able to bring against it is that it's been able to, it has claimed that it is acting in self-defense, and that this kind of carnage that it's carrying out is necessary because of how Hamas is embedded in Gaza, and in effect creating the impression that this amount of destruction is necessary for Israel validly to defend itself. And against that, James has referred to this, but South Africa also presented the evidence of genocidal intent, which would preclude a claim of mere self-defense. And secondly, of course, if the court does hear this case, if it says, yes, we have jurisdiction, grant some provisional measures, and then go on to the actual hearing, then we're going to have those claims of fact examined by a court of law. And for me, that's very exciting. It doesn't matter who's powerful and who's got more money. If you actually have a legal analysis of, okay, who did what to whom when, and what justifications, if any, are there. So let's not lose sight of where this might all lead, even though it's not providing much immediate relief.
Cathy makes some excellent points there, James. I mean, in any normal sphere, the law is the law. My question to you is, what if Israel don't abide by the law, as we've been seeing? What if they just ignore any ruling?
Well, International Court of Justice rulings are binding in theory. However, we've seen International Court of rulings, say, example, in Russia, on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, be completely ignored. And there is that risk. However, South Africa, presuming South Africa gets provisional measures, South Africa can take this to the UN Security Council and demand that the UN Security Council enforces measures. We have seen the United States repeatedly use its veto. However, I really think, given that the US expresses we live in a rules-based system, for the US to then, in the Security Council, veto a request from South Africa supporting an ICJ ruling, I'm not saying the US won't do it, but it would be quite damaging for the US on the international playing field to do so.
Wadie, my final question goes to you. This is a seismic moment, really, for everyone involved. If the Israelis lose this case and South Africa wins, Israel has a huge dilemma on its hands, doesn't it?
For sure. And I think that's why we've seen the vehemence of their response and the rhetoric that they've used, which is, a kind of a tactic to distract from the cold, hard facts, which South Africa presented in an incredibly compelling manner. So it's a very interesting question because Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said nothing is going to stop us, not the ICJ and not the axis of evil, which he's referring to Israel's enemies, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition here. So I think at least the rhetoric is that the Israelis don't really care what the measure is in terms of how it's going to affect their conduct, which is a terrifying thought to be sure, but I hope it's just mere bluster.
Wadie, Peter, Cathy and James, thank you all so much for your insights on this roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World and hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.